And I always spent Friday night with my mum in London whenever I could. I used to go home and help clean for Passover. So what happened is that I finally acknowledged how much I loved those things, and I could acknowledge in my philosophical work my debt and my love for my parents.
Hello and welcome to Confessions. I'm Giles Fraser. This is the podcast where I'm joined by an eminent guest to try and find out what it is that makes them tick. I'm going to try and drill down into their core beliefs to understand better who they are and what they're all about. And here today, bearing their soul in the stall to me this week, is Maurice Glasman, Baron Glasman of
Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill.
And this is going to be a difficult interview for me because, to be honest, I haven't really ever read much that Maurice Glasman's ever said that I disagree with very much.
You'll find something. I'm sure.
Maurice, so it's a pleasure to be here talking to you, mate.
That's mutual.
So the way this works, I've described it as a sort of desert island discs about your political philosophy, but without any music.
That's a shame.
You like the music. And what I mean by that is we sort of start by just talking through where you come from and your background and how your values might have developed out of that and how they might have changed over time and all that sort of stuff. So what I quite like you to do to start with is just tell me about, I guess, your mum and dad. I mean, you're one of these people, I'm going to say this before you start talking, that is well known for, you know, going to talk to student groups. And one of the things you say to them is, when was the last time you phoned your mum?
Yeah, that's how I used to begin my talks. Everybody ring home and tell your mum that you love them.
Exactly, right. So tell me about your mum.
Oh, my mum, well, it's a source of sorrow. My parents are dead, that's to begin with. And I'm from a dead tribe, which used to be a living, vivid tribe when I was growing up, which was working class Jews from the East End. So my mum left school at 13. She went to work in a factory, and so she was passionate about education, that the four of us should all go to university, and on that road was loads of tears. And both my parents really, but my mum in particular, combined being really orthodox religious. So we had Shabbos, the Sabbath was we couldn't touch money, we couldn't watch telly. It was lockdown really, which was very difficult for me as a Spurs fan growing up, because I used to miss the scores.
Found a point of disagreement already. There we are.
Used to miss the scores. But we went with the sociological changes. So, she was born in Stamford Hill. Her dad was a presser, who was on the whole unemployed, illiterate man, but absolutely loved man. And the other side of the story was that she was Labour and socialist, and the family was really involved in the 1905 revolution over there in Russia, in Belarus, a place called Mogilev. So all sides of the family came over in 1905 after the pogroms over there. So I was brought up, I realise now, and I was brought up socialist and religious, as if there was no contradiction between those things.
And in Stamford Hill?
No, I was brought up in Palmer's Green. So we moved to the North Circular. I was born in Walthamstow. There was a first step out of Stamford Hill was to Walthamstow. And then from Walthamstow to this place, Palmer's Green, which is sort of at the apex of the North Circular. We were in smelling and hearing distance of the North Circular Road, that great river, as I call it, that circles London like a moat. And so I was brought up really within the, Ernest Bevin said he was brought up within the bowels of the Labour movement. I was brought up within the bowels of the Jewish community of North London. Went to Clapton Jewish Day School. So at that stage, there weren't any Jewish schools in the suburbs. So we used to be driven back to the ancestral homeland, which was Stamford Hill. Went to school there, then went to JFS Comprehensive. But thinking back, we had a Jewish Cub Scouts, we had a Jewish jazz big band full of what I didn't know then was stoned dads who were just teaching the kids how to play jazz. And it's now completely disintegrated. There's hardly any Jews left there. There's very little social, but I'm just where I'm coming from.
And your dad, was he the same?
My dad was slightly different. His dad had a business. So my dad went to grammar school. So he was, to all intents and purposes, perfectly educated. He could recite poetry on the Sabbath, he used to do the Times crossword in his head because he couldn't write it down. And when the Sabbath went out, he just used, that's an abiding
Wow.
memory of him. And he wasn't as working class as my mum. And so interestingly, he was more liberal. He was a kind of, so the two of them together, my mum was fiercely ethical, very brave. My dad was gentle and much quieter. But between the two of them, I couldn't have been a luckier little boy. They were lovely people, and they gave me, looking back, with my aunts. My mum was the eldest of 5 sisters who lived within a sort of 600-yard radius of the house. So I was the sort of object of devotion from these 5 incredibly tough, strong women. And then there was my dad pushing me to read, pushing me to write, pushing me to be a little more thoughtful. So, I mean...
Sounds a sort of perfect
Well,
child.
growing up, I didn't appreciate it. So I kicked against, I really rejected the religion. I became, more left-wing and more liberal in truth. Looking back, quite self-indulgent. But as a foundation of life, it was I was.
But the
just
socialist
blessed.
Zionist type of thing that you got
Yeah.
from your mum was a sort of strong.
Yeah, she was socialist. The Zionism was curious. There was never any intention of living in Israel. That was not. So we were exiled Jews completely. I was brought up that way. I would say that there was a sympathy for Israel that was fundamentally driven by the experience of the Holocaust in our neither of my parents knew growing up in the war what was happening to the Jews. So this was a shock to them both. The idea that our families were all wiped out, that was a shock. So there was, I would say, a natural and
Belarus,
instinctive.
they must
All
have
of them
been.
gone. All of them gone. One bit of the family remains, and he's now, by some weird coincidence, a lecturer in sort of computer technology at the University of York. So there's literally no one left anymore. But that family survived by going to Azerbaijan, to Baku.
Oh wow.
They went east. But the rest of them, and I've been back, there was nothing left. So for my parents, this was a primal shock of their lives. But I wouldn't say that played a really big role. It was strongly left and strongly religious. So the important obligations on me was to always be home on Friday night. And as my dad used to say, be nice to your mum. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're going through, don't forget to be nice. And that was amazing.
So it was United Synagogue.
Completely.
Yeah.
And in Shaw, we were there. We were one of those. And very strong keeping of the Sabbath. So it was a day of rest. So that was the one day I wasn't allowed to do my homework, which was... But imagine,
Nice, but you couldn't go and...
But I couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
So the intensity of the boredom on long summer afternoons and evenings, because it was dark, we couldn't turn the lights on. But that was when members of the family would come round.
Not enough boredom not enough boredom.
I completely agree. So I try to impose this boredom on my children, and it's really, really hard.
Yeah, there's not the same restriction.
No, I haven't got the same
You haven't got the same clout as your
conviction.
mum.
No. Regrets of life.
So you took with you that sort of like drive for education that you get from your dad, and
Well, it
books
was
and
mum.
learning.
My dad was more sceptical about the education because he was more educated. My mum had the total devotion of someone who'd never been to school after the age of 13.
Yeah.
And I was trouble at school. I mean, that's a truthful remark. So
Right.
my mum really fought to sort of keep me in school.
Smoking already.
Smoking, definitely smoking, and smoking whatever I could get hold of, really, and within
Yeah.
the constraints of Palmer's Green.
Yeah.
Thinking about that. But my mum really kept me in school. I was sort of suspended quite a few times. I used to get into trouble. And then a teacher at my comprehensive school, Mrs. Wageman, who died last week, who was then deputy headmistress, but she just said, well, you're going to Cambridge. And she took me, these people
Mrs.
change.
Wageman.
Wageman. Josephine Wageman. Who
Cheers to Mrs. Wageman.
Cheers to
R.I.P.
her. I went to her funeral 3 weeks ago to say thank you, really, because she just said, okay, forget all that. She gave me sort of personal lessons, and I went to St Catherine's College, Cambridge, to study history, and that was a bit of a shocking result. If you looked at my school record, you wouldn't have predicted that happening.
And what was your time there like? I mean, was your kind of-
Terrible. I completely reacted against it. I hated it. I've got many sources of shame, and I was a really petulant, but also insecure sort of adolescent. I'd never really left Palms Green, the truth be
Okay.
told, and suddenly I turn up to the stuff that you would have, taken very easily. Coral Evensong.
Yeah.
It was an incredibly sort of minor public school environment, and I just got into music. Didn't turn up to study. Wanted to leave, but then my mum intervened. Well, my dad intervened and said, "You simply can't leave because of what it would do to your mother, and therefore what it would do to me, because she would blame him for being weak, accommodating, altogether liberal." So I was stuck. So in retrospect, the people there were incredibly kind. I gave the Boutwood lecture last week at Corpus Christi College on citizenship and faith. Looking back, Cambridge were incredibly accommodating, but at that time, I just wasn't interested.
So how did you grow up?
I left. I played trumpet and music for a while and realised that with a sense of total doom and tragedy and also penance, that actually studying was my vocation, that I'd kind of trashed what I was. So I went to York and did a master's in political philosophy, and then went to Italy and did my PhD in Florence, because my life has been incredibly lucky. And then I could study, and then I discovered Carl Polanyi, Machiavelli, and began to give shape to the intuitive politics that I felt Catholic social thought was a big part of that. Italy was a fantastic place to discover that.
Yeah.
And try to honour both the radicalism and the conservatism of my upbringing, which was so loving and supportive. So in many ways,
But for all your talk of rebellion, it sounds like your values grow very organically out of the sort of family background that you describe.
Totally, it's a complete expression of that. So in retrospect, I felt that I felt compelled to rebel. But the sources of my rebellion, well, there's two issues. The sources of my rebellion were incredibly superficial, just to reject my parents' stuff, and obviously looking at what I thought then a kind of fantasy world that bore no relation. But the other thing is, I don't think I really did rebel. I always went home for Friday. I always kept good relations with my
You went from
parents.
Cambridge, you went home
No,
Friday.
but when I was in London, I came back. When I
see.
came back from Cambridge and I lived away from home, I always spent Friday night with my mum in London whenever I could. I used to go home and help clean for Passover. So what happened is that I finally acknowledged how much I loved those things, and I could acknowledge in my philosophical work my debt and my love for my parents. That was incredibly.
I guess you need to
liberating
go
for
away
me.
in order to find what it is that
Yeah,
that how important that is.
Neither my mum nor my dad ever saw me really go straight. They never witnessed it. My dad died a long time ago, more than 22 years ago. My mum died sort of 12 years ago. So they never, but with my mum, I could at least tell her that she was right, before she died.
So there are people who probably listen to this who don't know the sort of core of how your thought grows out of that, or how would you describe what it is that you stand for?
Well, the position roughly described as Blue Labour, but also I call it a politics of the common good, and it begins with the idea that the progressive left has got human nature completely wrong. That we're social beings with a longing for attachment, longing for love, and a desire to contribute to society. So it's a socialist theory in the genuine sense of the word. So in technical things, goes back to Aristotle is a very important starting point for this, and it rejects the fundamentals of capitalism, because capitalism wishes to turn nature and human beings into commodities, and that's clearly such a fundamental category error, such a mistake, but that leads to the disruption of stability relationships. So a very strong stress on family. That's one part of it that I feel that the left don't get, is that the sacrifice, duty and obligation you feel for others, it kind of pushes a bit, without being dogmatic, on the virtues of being faithful, that yields, that is a part of love, but that doesn't mean that things don't work. It's just that that's a good a good starting point for making, so very strong stress on the importance of relationships and then on organising, on people working together. So I really came of age during the living wage campaign. I worked with London citizens on living wage, and I was totally happy with that. And that worked with faith communities, Catholic, Muslim, even Anglican.
Wow.
Giles, wow. But that came later on in the day.
You managed to get to Choral Evensong in the end.
No, they always wanted a host. This is the interesting thing. They wanted to host the discussions, but not actually.
Oh yeah, participate.
Yeah,
oh no, that's exactly right.
Get in the get
No,
into,
no, they don't. They don't want to get in the mix. They
get
just want to sort of,
into trouble. And really, when the crash came in 2008, my mum died then, so that all came together. So in one way, Blue Labour was just an enormous love letter to my mum, who exactly had those values.
Yes.
And I didn't at the time.
So the term was coined just after your mum died, really. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly then. There was talk then, nobody pays much attention now, but they're Red Tory.
Yeah, so
and I was like,
Philip Blonde's doing that.
so I wasn't Red Tory in any way. And I said, I'm Blue Labour. And my wife turned around and said, that changes everything. That.
Oh, is that right?
Phrase.
She put the finger on it,
Yeah,
did she?
she said, Blue Labour, that's what I am. And so the thing just grew from there. But there's loads of rivers, run through it. In the English tradition, you've got Tawny, GDH Cole, that whole pre-1945 Labour thing, which was led by poor people and was democratic, federalist, loved liberty.
But not an individual liberty. Not so much about individual liberty.
Yeah, but
that liberty grows out of a sort of strong sense of we.
Yeah, that you can't flourish as an individual without institutional and ethical support for that. So totally committed to religious freedom, freedom of expression. These are all individual liberties, but the roots of the liberty are to be found in political struggle to secure liberties. They're not some metaphysical gift that was given. So very critical of the exclusive reliance on the law to defend the liberties, and needs the active democratic support of people. And Catholic social thought was a big part of that. Obviously, the history of the actual labour movement and trade union movement in getting workers recognised as partners in the economy. So those are the essential rivers that.
So
run
as well
into
as being
Labour.
Sort of Jewish and socialist, there's a very strong English tradition to this as well.
Completely so. I mean, that's related to it. So I was brought up. My mum used to always bang it into me that only in England did the Jews live. She had the experience that the whole extended family in Eastern Europe was killed. So there was something about England that she thought was very special, and passed that on to me. And then studying history, it was the English Civil War. It was as if I lived through that.
And the beginnings of sort of one form of philo-Semitism that you get in the English Civil War. I mean, on the Puritan side with Cromwell and people being. I mean, all of those Puritans seem to be named after Old Testament prophets, don't they?
But
Zechariah.
It's got to be borne in mind that from the age of around 16, I was desperately trying to forget I was Jewish. So that wasn't part of that. Came much later. The reconciliation for me came when I was working with faith communities, and I realised that they had to say I was working with people and supporting people who had just the same values as my mum, and then the dignity that their faith gave them. It was their faith that meant that they weren't going to be treated just like commodities or just like servants or serfs or even slaves in the modern system. And I began to realise the ethical resources and the ethical traditions that came from faith were complementary, not hostile to the kind of society, and that we had to work with people of faith in order to build a more democratic and just
So you never
society.
quite got to tell your mum that you'd returned to the
Just
fold.
about, but problem is she had a terrible illness. It was called progressive supranuclear palsy. Now, if you think about every word of that, that's when I ceased to be progressive, because I realised
That's a terrible. I don't know why I'm laughing at that.
Because it's
I'm
funny.
sorry.
Because things don't only get better. So my favourite
that
joke.
horrible D. Ream song from 1997.
To constituency Labour parties is, it's the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor. It's progressive.
Yes.
And we've got this idea that progressive, it means that everything's going to get better. Things can only get better, that the arc of history, and we've got to be on the right side. When in fact, it could go really wrong. And what stops it going wrong, and this links back to England, is that what stopped fascism in England was a very strong alliance between Labour and the Conservatives. It was a broad-based coalition that protected liberty, that protected democracy. So that had a massive effect on my politics and the development of the politics.
These are not today's left-wing politics, are they? I mean, it's a sort of the Corbynist sort of like slight metropolitan liberal alliance is describing something very different from where you are.
Yeah, it is, but I'm not as hostile as you would think because of my fundamental. Blue Labour emerged out of a hostility to New Labour and this really strong managerialism, technological determinism, a kind of cosmopolitan multilateral politics, but above all, a totally uncritical attitude to capitalism. That essentially globalization was to be embraced; it was inevitable, and so I don't view it in the normal way that you would imagine. There needs to be a reckoning with that. That's what I think is happening now. But in that reckoning, the party is becoming much more middle class, much more liberal, and that will never be accepted by the working class. It's just so. I'm looking for the dialectical synthesis that comes after.
But you're
this.
an alliance. You're an alliance builder, aren't you? That's part of your.
Yeah. So I have very good conversations with John McDonnell. I'm really engaged with the sort of radical economic position that Labour's building, without being persuaded at all by the more liberal legal. But that's playing out over Brexit completely in the Labour Party. I mean, overwhelming majority of the new members are all, for some reason, supportive of the greatest, capitalist machine that's ever been invented by the mind of human beings, which is the EU, which by treaty law.
This is what I mean. You and I both share a sort of left-wing Brexity position and so forth. And what amazes me is there's a whole tranche of the left that have been persuaded. I think they were probably persuaded under Blair
and Jacques Delors.
Jacques Delors. But that particular time, that actually the EU is something that works well with being of the left. It just completely, I suppose I'm an old Bennite in that regard.
Yeah, and I am too in that regard. But it's a very important story, and it's a historical, ethical, political story, is that the progressive left can't make a distinction between globalization and internationalism. So they see any form of global capitalism as inherently and essentially progressive. So and also they learnt over the many years of Thatcherism to dislike and be wary of their own countrywomen and men. They began to fear the working class and democratic politics. So they retreated to a legal order that would essentially make it illegal to resist capitalism. And the extraordinary thing that I lived through is that that's the mainstream progressive position. So it begins with a very strong distinction that I make between globalization, which is essentially a form of capitalism that renders it impossible to resist the domination of the rich and the powerful, that works exclusively in the interests of middle-class people, and an internationalism where you actually can show your solidarity with people in other countries who are trying to resist those things.
So I want you to spell this out a bit, because one of the things that you and I will both be accused of is wanting socialism in one country. That there is a sort of, that's what happens with the sort of Lexit.
Little England, yeah.
Little England,
yeah.
Yes.
No, it's not. So I've just come back from 2 weeks with the Shia in Iraq, going on this Arbaeen, this pilgrimage in honour of 40 days after Imam Hussein was killed. And the incredible thing about this march is that for three people walk from hundreds of miles. They walk from Basra, they walk from Lebanon, they walk from Iran, and they're urged to leave without a penny in their pockets. They get fed and housed along the way by local communities, by Shia. It's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. But it's as if all we can take inspiration from is some kind of flexible work time arrangement in the EU. There's a whole world full of resistance and life that we're completely neglecting. I went to Krakow recently, to Poland, to talk about Brexit, and to say that the EU is a complete betrayal of the principles of solidarity. Solidarity was for workers' democracy, representation in the workforce, and when they join the EU, smash, 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 you just have to be prey to the forces, the systematic forces of finance and global capitalism as they destroy your factories, as they disrupt your life. So there's no status for work over there. So Brexit opens the possibilities of building global solidarity, of genuine international solidarity. But the thing that I think the key of this issue is they don't like democracy. They don't like the idea that we live here on this island with each other, and that there's people in the country who feel that globalization really treated them very badly, that they felt excluded, they felt humiliated. And those are the people that I really like to work with. And just to say about the referendum campaign, which keeps on coming back to me, I went to town hall meetings all over the country that were just a delight. That people understood that if they didn't vote out, they'd never be listened to again by the money and the educated elites. So this is a absolutely necessary jolt to the idea that you don't live with others. That's the whole thing with the social nature of the person and democracy. You've got to find a common life with others. And under the EU, it was just the domination of money and the domination of qualifications and education, and people couldn't do anything about it. So the key thing is the renewal of democracy. So you've got to renew the democracy nationally and renew our solidarities all over the world.
What I really want to ask you about, one of the things that Blue Labour's often described as, family, faith and flag and all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to ask you something about nationalism, really, and about the nation, because it's one of those ideas which is which has a sort of, for a lot of people, especially on the left, is in low repute. I think that's probably not true of the sort of working class left that is important to you. That, very, very keen on their country, but there is a sense in which this is something to be, that the nation is something to be disparaged, something to be suspicious of, and so forth. That's not going to be your line, is it?
No. So the first thing to say is no one ever associated with Blue Labour ever used family, faith and flag. This was kind of put on us, and it kind of stuck. So it was Sarah Palin talked about it, and it's actually a trilogy that's quite associated with fascism and third way movements, to coin the phrase, in Europe in the 20s and the 30s. So recognising the importance of family in people's lives and the resources and commitments that faith can bring to democratic politics is important. But let's just get to the flag. So it remains the case that the nation is the decision-making point of politics, that's the democratic unit, and that there is a history there. So speaking here for Blue Labour, we completely take the colonial part of the history, the repressive part of the history, as part of the story of resistance. But also, to go back to what my mum said, that there are wonderful things to be treasured about English and British history, not least Parliament, not least the common law, not least the emergence of a labour movement that could resist and win, and the nature of our democratic struggle, which is genuinely inspiring. So, to renew ourselves as a democratic nation is the
and the nation
imperative.
state is the sort of upper limit of democratic legitimacy, isn't
exactly. But also to reconstitute the body politic. That's an enormous part of working on these ideas of the parish commune, of a local decision making, and that brings together the church history, that the church was present in every place. And also the commune element, that there's a democratic local assembly. So if things could be decided locally in assemblies relating to education, relating to housing, that would be a real renewal of the polity. But also there's the vocation, the renewal of the counties, and these aspects of it. So and then you can only have an internationalism if you're coming from somewhere, if you're representative of something, if you genuinely have a body and a leadership that represents that body. So the politics of England and the politics of the nation are a central part, and we don't cease to be inspired by the stories that we find there of radicalism, stories of resistance that all take place within the frame of Parliament and the frame of the national institutions.
You say England there, so what about, would you have understood Scottish independence, for instance?
Not particularly. It's just important to say that the union, the Act of Union, where we're coming from, was a great thing for Scotland too. That this has been a very good union. I love the fact that we're a multinational country. I think that's fundamental to the story where no nation can dominate, and it's always also put a constraint on English chauvinism. That's really important. But I completely reject the Scottish nationalism stuff, which demonises England, demonises the English. I found that referendum extremely ugly in that regard, but it was great that we won.
Not a united Ireland. You still believe in the.
Well, this is getting so.
It's getting quite. I am getting.
Yeah.
But I'm talking. I suppose
No,
I'm talking
no, I
about
get
the
it.
union. Really.
I get it. So there's got to be a referendum now in Northern Ireland. This is the solution, and they've got to, they've got to be put the choice out the EU in the United Kingdom or a united Ireland inside the EU. If you want to know, my actual position is a united Ireland outside the EU. That's what I'd really like to see,
Yes,
and that's what my politics moves to.
Yeah.
But that's not.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
agenda should be quite simple and resolve that issue. But I do think that Ireland is being craven to the EU and it's being used by the EU, when in fact, if you look at the history of the British Isles and the island and Ireland, there was free movement between the countries. You could vote. All of this, all the excellent relations that were developed after independence between Britain and Ireland, are in fact being used by the EU in order to stop Brexit, and that's bad.
I mean, the one thing that bothers me about it, and where you and I, that maybe there's a little bit of difference between you and I, is when it comes to immigration on this, because I have a sort of, my instincts are much more open bordersy. I mean, particularly more with regard to those who are vulnerable, and I sort of, I mean, I'm not so bothered by doctors being able to work here and there, and very sort of like particularly educated people, but actually people who are running away from, say, places in northern Iraq where there's been such violence. I think we have a moral obligation to be open to people like that. Where do we differ on that? Where do we differ on
so
that?
this is a really important issue, and we've got to sort it out. And I think this is the best place to sort it out. What I'm saying is and what I said is that immigration is a political issue. It has to be discussed publicly and politically, and you can't retreat behind globalization and human rights law as people's communities and lives are being utterly transformed. And I think my experience is the instinct of the people is they understand, first of all, that we need to show solidarity to people in distress. That I think that could be one politically. But there was an aspect of this in relation to free movement within the EU that was just undercutting workers' pay and conditions. And there wasn't a move in the labour movement. It was very difficult to organise immigrants into trade unions. So there was a huge aspect of this where it was workers at cheaper rates. So this was a form of capitalism that disrupted solidarity. Now, human beings are social beings. It takes time to build the institutions of that. So essentially what the EU represented was unrelenting rates of immigration about which you could do nothing. So my position is you've got to be very strong, go out, say immigration is necessary. Also, we need to build common institutions, particularly within the labour movement, that can stand up for people's human status in the labour market. So immigration is a necessary and has always been a necessary part of life. What my concern was, by removing it from politics, there was a hostility growing to it, and it's still my concern that it's about the rise of a populist right, which we've seen in America and which we could see here. And the essential condition for challenging that is to say that, yeah, there's things you can do about it. So if you want people coming from Kurdish Syria, that's an argument to be made publicly and politically, but not dressed up as an eternal form of legal order. It's to bring the immigration into the mainstream politics and then make a very strong argument for solidarity with immigrants, but also the building of a common life. So there's a big streak in this that resists multiculturalism. I see very divided cities in our country with very ugly politics around it. So the big challenge ahead is how to build in the small towns and the small cities a sense of a common fate, a common life between communities that are essentially divided between white and brown. That's what I'm seeing. So I don't think that there is a fundamental difference between us. My instincts and my starting point are those of love, sympathy, and solidarity, but it's important that that's viewed politically and not taken out the political sphere, because there's an important component where it undercuts solidarity and undercuts also people's wages.
And the way in which the accusation racism is used when whether applied to this debate is often entirely unhelpful.
Well, yeah, but it's remorseless. So that was my experience. I tried to raise the issue 7-8 years ago, and you'd think, for me, in my vanity, I thought, well, I'd worked for the last 10-12 years with immigrant organisations through London Citizens. Living wage was overwhelmingly run by immigrants. There's no way this could be, but there it came.
Still pinned on
there
you.
it came.
You're a racist.
And so I had to take it and really stand by it, because if they went for me, then goodness knows how they were going to take to people who were just expressing normal concerns. And that's what happened. People don't get it. That's what happened in the Brexit vote. They say it's all racist and it's all anti-women. No, it was an assertion that through politics you could slow down the rate of change, you could build different solutions. So I didn't perceive an overwhelmingly anti-immigrant sentiment. I just perceived a democratic sentiment that wished to... the people were concerned about the conditions of their life in the economy, on their streets, in the communities where they lived, and that's completely legitimate.
You talked about human rights just a moment ago, and I'm interested in the way in which the language of human rights, or the moral language of human rights, has a particular sort of particular sense of what human beings are like, which is fairly deracinated and unconnected. And I have a problem with the only using human rights as our sort of moral language when there's so many other moral languages that we could choose.
Exactly.
I mean, I imagine you're in a similar position to that.
Yeah, so I've seen... So we all support human rights. This is the nutty thing about it, is that there's... human beings are sacred. There's things you shouldn't do to them. Nobody should be tortured. Nobody should be humiliated. These are all matters of fundamental consensus. But that's not what human rights mean. Human rights mean a specific liberal order which excludes democracy from making decisions. So immigration would be an example. Human rights law demands that you have to accept the immigrants. But there's also issues about family life, about transsexuality, that if you engage in a political discussion about it, you're seen as opposing human rights and you're seen as being abusive. So it's become, in fact, a tin-eared liberal agenda that wishes to hive things out of a democratic political discussion. So entirely unhelpful and, on the whole, quite nasty, because it tries... there's no one more exclusive than those who believe in inclusivity. These are blue Labour rules, No one more intolerant than those who uphold toleration. And human rights is a way that you don't do the politics. If you want to build a society based on liberty and democracy, you've got to go out and build coalitions and build political movements. You can't rely on lawyers.
But isn't the sort of politics that you describe and that you regret... extremely prominent in the Labour Party. I mean, that's the sort of that's the politics that's there, and those of us, you and I, who are sort of just about... well, I'm just about in the Labour Party. You're a Labour peer, but who find myself like increasingly feeling on the edge and alienated from the sort of discussion that's had.
But
how did it happen? How did it come to be like this?
Oh, it's a combination of things. I don't think that's an entirely inclusive analysis. I would say those people make a lot of noise, that the Labour Party leadership to some extent is dominated by lawyers and, university graduates, above all lawyers. Lawyers are on the whole very anti-political. They think that there's legal solutions to all these issues. Also loads of, teachers who also tend to be that way. But don't forget, 40% of the Labour vote is still working class vote. They haven't changed. The Labour Party must come into contact with its voters, and many of the constituencies that the Labour needs are overwhelmingly Leave constituencies. So I don't see it.
You're not a Keir Starmer fan, are you?
No, but it's just boring and makes no sense. But in that sense, I am a John McDonnell fan. Don't forget that Labour's position is to leave the EU.
Yes, absolutely.
That I mean, at party conference, it was clear, it was like at least 90% of the membership were quite fanatically supportive of Remain. But John McDonnell stood up and said, yeah, people's vote, yeah, it's called a general election, and the choice is going to be between a Tory Brexit and a Labour Brexit. And that's party position. So, the reaction to the new Labour years is going to take a while, but it's very important to assert that the overwhelming body of the Labour tradition was Brexit. We're bringing out a book, Clement Attlee, Ernest Bevin, Aneurin Bevan, Barbara Castle, Peter Shaw, Michael Fort, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn, Dennis Healey. All their best work was why the EU is a fundamental capitalist, anti-democratic organisation. And that will be reasserted, and it is still actually the party position. There's liberals and people who went to university, they are very verbal and they make a huge amount of noise. It's a pleasure to be on this quiet podcast, which resists the domination of that.
Well, unfortunately, I'm trying to make more noise, but I agree with you. So it's hard.
But the dominant thing, I read that on the night of the Brexit vote, the BBC couldn't find a single person in Broadcasting House who supported Brexit. These are echo chambers of liberalism, and the Guardian the same. But on the streets, it's not like that. And I'm telling you, also in the Labour Party, it's not like that. I get invited to Momentum, I get invited to constituency parties, and there's a genuine discussion about it. I mean, there's always going to be 20% of people who say it's fascist, it's racist, and get into an incredible huff. But then when that passes, so I think,
Jeremy's a Brexiter, isn't he?
I think so. I mean, we've got a speech from him we're going to publish from sort of 8 years ago. That just nails the EU for what it is. He's a bit Harold Wilson-y. He's trying to, keep things together. He doesn't want to piss off the entire membership. That's completely understandable. Yeah. I think John McDonnell is more aggressively, because he understands that, none of Labour Party's manifesto could be implemented within the framework of the EU, and that in many ways the people have already moved to Brexit. They're already thinking about, the argument is already brewing between liberal globalisers and National Democrats, and that Labour's really wishes to use the state to have an industrial policy for redistribution, for nationalisation. All of this is completely against Maastricht and Lisbon. So I'm just saying that there's a genuine subterranean discussion going on there that we've got to get stuck into, rather than just, oh my God, walking away.
Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism. How's that all played out? I mean, you must have strong views about that.
Yeah, I do. It's not the thing that I tend to battle about. I think that there is a streak on the left, and always has been a streak on the left, that is essentially, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that Jews control finance, that Jews control banking. There's a secret conspiracy to control the world. I mean, it was Babel, who's related to Marx, who said that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. That's been there. That came through in the Russian Revolution, when in the end they brought in Jewish quotas, and then there's the additional aspect of Zionism, where Israel is seen as a colonial state supported by the United States, and that the Jewish community in the United States controls the United States foreign policy. So a central view of a Jewish conspiracy that's carried on the left, and that's carried in the Muslim community as kind of true. So that's one side of it where I think it really is real. But on the other side, I've got my conversation with the Jewish community about showing some solidarity with the poor, and asking themselves which side they're on in this battle, and looking what happened to my family happened to the Jewish community. We used to be poor, but we're not poor anymore. And not to retreat into the suburbs and into exclusion and have an eternal view, but to build relationships with other people, particularly on issues relating to the economy, poverty.
Some of the rabbis are a little bit afraid of doing the political thing.
Very afraid of getting into trouble, and also to recognise that we're not here as a lobby group for Israel. That's absolutely, we're here as part of this society. So I'm a Jew of exile, that you've got to build relationships, that we're essentially a weak community, we're a small community, and we need to build relationships with others on matters of. So much more important to me is this whole issue going on at the moment with Ofsted and the religious schools.
Yeah.
Where,
Absolutely.
Hasidic Jews who carry an incredibly important part of the Jewish are being told that unless they teach a positive view of transsexuality, they're going to be closed down. Now, this is an incredible threat to the integrity. I mean, this is human rights law going nuts. When did it happen that you had to take an uncritical view of that? Now, when it comes to the LGB, I think there's definitely room for manoeuvre. You are obliged not to have a hateful view, but when it comes to transsexuality, I think there's a whole public debate.
But the whole thing. I mean, if you talk to Rabbi Pinter up in Stamford Hill and his school up there, I mean, his line on this is that, like, look, we just don't do sex education. It's not like we do.
Yeah, well, they've got a really important thing which the whole of society should be aware of about the sexualization of childhood, the commodification of that. But it's just the liberal authoritarianism that insists that everything, that's the problem with the human rights agenda. It becomes a political agenda that's authoritarian and imposes and eliminates diversity.
I don't know if you saw the other day, but that school,
was
19th in the league tables of best schools in the country when it came out, and it's still.
This is an incredible school. So, as Lord of Stamford Hill, I visited yesterday Torah.
Yes. Oh, you went there, yes.
Many times.
Yes.
I love yesterday Torah because it's a school that educates girls. So, what's the extraordinary transformation in the Hasidic community in Stamford Hill is that the girls now get incredible exam results. They're completely literate in English. They are absolutely functional in running the community. The power balance has changed completely towards the women when it comes to running the community, because the men on the whole are completely useless in this regard. So a massive transformation in the life prospects and internal world of women has gone on through that school, and that's the school they want to close down because it won't teach a positive view of transsexuality. This at least should be discussed politically and not imposed in such an. But the point I'm making to you is that should be the concern of Jews in this country, not about the West Bank or, there's things about Israel that are really terrible and that need to change, and that we should be really publicly forceful about that and not allow that conflict to define our relations with all other people. That is a catastrophe.
So what does Maurice Glasman enjoy doing? What does he find rather than he's not just changing the world?
Oh, I'm going to say I'm not. In a lot of ways, I'm trying to preserve the world. That's the.
Yes, exactly.
I love Parliament. I want to keep Parliament as a democratic institution. I love the Labour movement and wish to keep working class people at the forefront of that. So when I say that Blue Labour is this mixture of radical and conservative, the conservative is really prominent. I love the common law as a means of adjudicating the legal issue rather than Napoleonic directive. So politics and the doing of politics, the building of relations is an enormous part of my life and an endless source of joy, because you meet people you wouldn't meet, and relationships are formed. Recently I went to Iraq and I took a television camera with me to record the Arbaeen, so maybe I'll make a television program about that, and that would be great. I make music, I play music and play with other people, but ultimately, I've got a wife and 4 children, and although they really hate me, I kind of have an enormous love for them.
Really hate me. But people say to me, what are you doing now? Yeah. When, if you meet people you haven't seen for ages and they say, what are you doing now? The real answer is I'm spending time with my family and I'm enjoying time with my family. And that's actually the thing that I think I should say that more often, really, because they want to know what I'm writing. But it's actually it's 10% of what I do now.
Yeah, and my children now, I've got a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 12-year-old, and it's just the horror of them growing up. That's what's overwhelming me. My 20-year-old is a really horrible momentum-supporting sort of secular Marxist who thinks I'm an enormous sellout. And but my daughter is really beginning to make sense of things. It's an incredible thing. So yeah, so I just like.
And you get to the Spurs. Do you go to the Spurs?
I do go to. We're in exile. We're in Wembley. So you have to go to northwest London. It feels like a desecration every time. So Spurs.
You're not doing that well, are you?
Well, we're doing better than Arsenal, and that really is what matters.
That's okay. I agree. We share a common dislike of the Arsenal.
Who's your thing?
Chelsea fan.
That's very bad. That's very, very, very
Overweight,
bad.
short hair. What do you think? I'm a Chelsea fan.
But all that wealth stolen from Russia and
I
invested in the richest area of
I put my
London,
fingers in my ears.
It's just awful.
Don't you bring your politics into bloody football?
Oh, I can't keep them out.
Well, so I'm going to have to apologise to the listener because I've been a crap interviewer. I have tried as much as I can to disagree with Maurice Glasman, and the only thing I found is Harry Kane, really, which and Spurs and
well, you know,
that's about it.
Moussa Dembele. Moussa Dembele is actually the really great player at Spurs,
which has not really been very satisfactory. But it's always with pleasure and with profit that I talk to Maurice Glasman. And thanks very much for coming and sitting here and having a chat with me.
It's great to see you.
Cheers,
Thanks.
mate. Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.